It was the courtship that helped deliver Labor government, and there was a lengthy honeymoon where the parties worked together to get the carbon tax through. But now the relationship between Labor and the Greens is on the rocks, with Labor threatening to preference the Greens last in future elections. It's just one more crack in the tenuous arrangement keeping Labor in power federally, and it's prompting warnings that a Labor-Greens breakup could hand the coalition control of the Senate after the next federal election. Heather Ewart reports.
It was once a civilised affair. The Greens and Labor, with great fanfare, signing an agreement to form minority government. But resentment in Labor ranks has simmered pretty much ever since and is now at boiling point.
People in the Labor Party across the country are saying enough is enough.
This, I think, a completely deceitful notion that the Greens peddle about Labor not having core values, that Labor not standing for anything. That's a complete nonsense.
We think that voters symbolically should know that the Labor Party doesn't automatically consider itself an ally of the Green political party. They're very different to us on a whole range of issues.
We are the Progressive Party. Labor's now mired in this breakup caused by the right wing in New South Wales, but it's Labor's problem.
Senior ALP New South Wales right figures publicly kicked off a campaign at the weekend to take a new tough line on the Greens, including preferencing them last in some key contests. State Secretary Sam Dastyari spearheaded it, backed by union leader Paul Howes, whose stance on the Greens has been no secret for months.
Well, the Greens aren't a part of our movement. The Greens don't stand for what our movement stands for.
After plenty of muttering behind the scenes, now the battle is on in earnest, with the Greens stung into action and both sides trading blows, including the now retired Bob Brown, who signed the original deal.
Dastyari's position, Paul House's position, is a gift to Tony Abbott. How hurting is that for Labor voters? Their only option is to come across to the Greens.
It's confusing to Labor voters, it's confusing to them. They don't know what Labor's are standing for if that's the type of track they go down.
Maybe it was always just a matter of time as Labor watched its support base eroding. But the New South Wales push to be put to the vote at its state conference this weekend, with a motion to no longer give the Greens automatic preferencing, has opened the floodgates to Labor frustration around the country. And the catalyst was the recent debate on asylum seekers policy in the Parliament, which failed to find any compromise as boats were sinking.
Labor backbenchers across the country were furious at the decision of the Green political party to support the Liberals and block any real deal on compromise on asylum seekers. It's not good enough to let people continue to drown at sea.
Well, on some issues we disagree with the Greens. For example, the Greens and the Liberal Party voted in the Senate in the last week of sitting to knock out offshore processing for asylum seekers. The Liberal Party was pretty loopy about that as well.
When the Greens didn't compromise, I think there's some elements within their constituency are wondering if they took the right course, and now Labor's ramping up some of that.
Labor sees the chance to capitalise on genuine anger in the community about the Greens' failure to give ground on offshore processing. Mind you, that anger is directed at all sides. But if the Greens are worried about the public mood, they're not budging on policy in the least.
The Greens are our own party. We are willing to work with the other parties to get good outcomes, but not at the expense of the law, not at the expense of humanity, not at the expense of doing the right thing.
It's a state by-election for the inner suburban seat of Melbourne in 2 weeks' time that might put that sentiment to the test. The seat has been held by Labor for decades. The Liberals are not fielding a candidate, and polls show the Greens could well wrest it from the ALP. Again, the battle lines are drawn.
You can use it to create something really powerful and challenge the two major parties to do better. Thank you for your time.
And whether our brand is stronger than the Greens, well, that's a matter for voters to determine. But what I'm certain of is no Green has ever defeated a Conservative government. Only Labor can do that, but only with the support of progressive people in Melbourne and other seats.
You get the drift of the message, and it's one that key Labor members would like to see repeated around the country at the federal election when it comes to preferences.
The Greens will not be getting first preferences from the Labor Party in Melbourne ports.
Would you put the Liberal Party ahead of the Greens in your seat?
We could well do that, depending on who some of the other political parties are. If there is a more extreme political party, etc., we'll be putting them last.
That's all very well in the House of Representatives, but for the Senate it could be a very different story. Some in the party fear its right wing is grandstanding, and this could deliver a result like another Family First senator, or at worst for Labor, a coalition majority in the upper house.
The practical implications could be dangerous for the Labor Party post 2013. So I think that's something that Labor Party needs to factor in when it's making these threats about preferences and its relationship with the Greens. What sort of Senate do we want after 2013?
If this keeps going, it's going to be the end of the noble tradition of light on the hill. That's been now taken up by the Greens.
I think if there's a consistent determination by both the major political parties to treat the Greens as a sort of left-wing version of Pauline Hanson's One Nation, then it can work.
It's an appeal to the coalition to take the high moral ground as well and not preference the Greens, just as Victorian Premier Ted Baillieu did at the last state election, and he won. But the federal opposition is not exactly rushing to respond to that idea.
And a short time ago, I was joined from Newcastle by the Chief Government Whip, Joel Fitzgibbon. Joel Fitzgibbon, why is it the Greens' fault all of a sudden that Labor's primary vote is abysmal? Isn't that your fault?
Well, I think what you're seeing here is a manifestation of a lot of pent-up pressure over the last couple of years in particular, and it all came to a head, of course, in the last parliamentary sitting week when the Greens stifled any opportunity we had to finding a workable solution to the very serious asylum seeker issue. I mean, the Greens stood alone in that parliament as the only group not prepared to compromise and embrace some form of offshore processing.
But on that issue, the Greens and the Coalition have had a consistent position on that for quite a long time. If you ask the average punter what the Greens were going to do on that, they would say, you know, here's what their policy is. If you ask the average punter about Labor, they'd say, oh, well, you know, they used to support getting rid of offshore processing because it was inhumane, and now they support something else. I'm not really sure. Isn't the issue here that voters aren't sure what Labor stands for?
Well, we've all had consistent positions, but in a hung parliament, we need to learn to compromise or at least become part of the conversation. I mean, it wasn't only the major parties that were prepared to give a bit. People as diverse as Bob Katter, Rob Oakeshott, Tony Windsor and Andrew Wilkie were all prepared to give ground. Indeed, in the end, voted for offshore processing. The Greens, I think, were wrong to stand alone and denied the Parliament an opportunity to walk away that week with a workable solution.
So is this discussion now about distancing yourself from the Greens all a payback for their position on asylum seekers?
Look, I think it's for me, it's simply about accountability. If the Greens want to do these things, that's fine. The main objective of my article in The Telegraph was to ensure that people understood what they had done. Now, you know, they're now through 10% in the order of 12% of the primary vote. Now, the major parties spend most of their time being held to account for their policies. Yet we allowed the Greens to go out there with populist and sometimes extreme policies in order to drag away from the major parties, and in particular the Labor Party, our primary vote. And we, in a way, encouraged them to do so by sending the message that no matter what they do or say, they will receive Labor preferences at the next election. Well, I think that has to change.
But it's not like the Greens have released a whole heap of policies overnight. They've had these policies for a long time. Why is Labor going down this route now?
Well, because I think the asylum seeker debacle was a siren call for me, but I think to people generally. It's a realisation that if the Greens want to be a major force holding more than 10% of the primary vote, they should face serious levels of accountability. People should know what they stand for, because the reality is that we are almost giving them our imprimatur to go out there with populist policies, steal our vote, and then of course be rewarded with preferences. Well, maybe preferences are only one of the few levers we have to ensure they face the same sort of accountability as we do.
Is it fair to say, though, that the progressive part of Labor's base has drifted to the Greens, not because of the Greens' appeal, but because people are disillusioned with Labor?
No, look, Labor got a very solid proportion of the primary vote at the last election and will continue to do so. But as you know, Labor's base vote has been effectively split for a long time between what I would call the traditional blue-collar base and the more progressive base you'll typically find around the capital cities. And the Greens are exploiting this. They're going out there with extreme policies. I used the example today, the abolition of all TAFE fees and charges. Now, we would all like to do that, but it's not realistic. We have all of our policies costed. No one's asked the Greens to cost their education policy. I suspect, having had a look at it, it would run to the billions of dollars. And all I'm saying is that they should be held to account. And one of the levers we have in order to hold them to account is to say, well, if you're going to be out there with populist and in some circumstances extreme policies, we're going to reflect on where we send our preferences.
Do you think that those working class voters that you've identified as making up half of your base are confused that Labor and the Greens are basically the same thing?
Well, they shouldn't be confused. We have to stay on message, and we need to be able to demonstrate that we remain independent of the Greens. We create our own policy and progress our own policy. There is an emerging perception in the community since the advent of the hung parliament and the deal with the Greens that we are being, as someone put it today, pulled by the nose by the Greens. It's about time we sent a very clear message that that isn't the case, and the preference arrangements is one tool available in which to do so.
You have a formal agreement in writing with the Greens to retain government, yet now some Labor figures are labelling them loony extremists. Does this also add to the impression that it's unclear what Labor stands for? One minute you're in bed with the Greens and the next minute they're in the doghouse.
Well, just because we might disagree with the Greens in a range of areas doesn't mean we can't work with the Greens in areas in which there is agreement. The carbon price is the perfect example.
On this question of drifting to the Greens, let me give you the example of gay marriage. Your traditional base overwhelmingly supports the rights of gays to marry, but the Prime Minister's opposed to it, along with half the Cabinet. So again, the problem here is with Labor itself, isn't it, in that you are not reflecting the values of your own base?
Well, that's certainly a good example of the split in our base, the one I spoke about earlier, the traditional blue-collar workers and those that typically are more progressive and congregate in the capital cities. And these issues are complicated enough for us without allowing the perception to stand that we are too close to the Greens.
Joel Fitzgibbon, thank you very much.
Thanks, Lee. That's a pleasure.